Good afternoon, everyone. I am Margaret Ticasan from the UPOU Office of Gender Concerns, and I'd like to formally welcome you to UPOU's Office of Gender Concerns webinar on gender responsive and feminist research. On behalf of our office, thank you very much for taking an interest in our webinar and for making the time to attend. Before we formally start, I'd like to discuss a few reminders. Let me just share my screen. Sorry. Ayan po. So I'd like to remind everyone that this webinar is currently live streamed. So we do have Zoom participants with us, which are UPOU faculty and staff, but we really wanted to open this webinar to the public. So we have decided to live stream this event in our Facebook page, YouTube, and UPOU Network's website. So just a few webinar proper reminders. For our Zoom participants, please remember to mute your microphone while the training proper is ongoing. Please remember that the webinar is live streamed. So if you may, please turn off your cameras. That would be very much appreciated. And then later on, during our question and answer portion, after our research person has discussed the topics that she has prepared, please raise your hand so our technical team may unmute you. So this is the time where we welcome you to turn on your cameras, unmute yourselves, and you may raise your questions. So you may also use the Zoom chat to raise any questions or concerns or any insights that you may have. All right. For our stream participants, so ayan, welcome po. So you may use the comment sections for your questions. So sa ating pong Facebook pages, sa ating pong YouTube feed, sa ating pong network's website, please, you are very much welcome to use the comment sections to raise any insights and questions you may have. We will be recording these, and then later on po sa question and answer, we will also be addressing this kasi participants din po kayo. Ayan. So yan po, number 2, we will be monitoring and including any questions you may have during the webinar. So these questions and or concerns will be addressed during the question and answer portion. Okay po. So lastly po for everyone, for both our Zoom participants and our live stream participants, please make sure that you have registered for the webinar through this link. Reminder lang po, for the Zoom participants, which is UPOU faculty and staff, you do not need to register for the event. Kami na po yung mag-record nun. Pero for our live stream participants, please take note that you have registered for the event using this link po, bit.ly/34 capital E, capital G, small letter N, capital F, and capital G. If not po, you can always go back to our Facebook page sa UPOU Office of Gender Concerns, pati po sa UPOU official Facebook page. We have indicated the registration form link there po. So you can go back to that po, and then yung registration form na po yun, it will close at 3 p.m. I apologize for the typo. So bakit po ito important? Yung evaluation form link po, isa-send po namin siya after the webinar through the email addresses you have provided in the registration form. So dun po through the evaluation form link, once you have accomplished this, your e-certificates will be automatically generated. Yan. So after nyo pong matapos yung evaluation form po namin. Ayun po. I will remind this later din po after the webinar so you won't forget. Ayun po. Okay po. So to formally start our webinar, I'd like to welcome our director, Dr. Joanne V. Serrano, for our opening remarks.
Okay, thank you, Majet. I hope everyone can hear me. Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Pride Month. Again, welcome to this webinar on gender responsive and feminist research organized by the Office of Gender Concerns of the UP Open University. UPOU has always been a staunch advocate of gender equality, and in all areas that we do in the university, we try to mainstream gender, be it teaching, public service, or research, with the hope that we truly become a gender-responsive institution. In today's webinar, we are focusing on gender-responsive and feminist research. I know that it is always a challenge for many researchers to integrate the gender dimension in our research. We always find ourselves asking, is gender disaggregated data enough to make a research somehow have that gender dimension? Or should we make sure that the participants or respondents are always gender balanced? Or did we use gender fair language in our in writing the manuscript? Or is including a gender or feminist framework enough to make it gender responsive? All these questions will be answered this afternoon by our resource speaker. And with this, I am honored to introduce to you our resource person, Dr. Nathalie Africa Verceles, or NATSI. NATSI is the director of the University of the Philippines Center for Women and Gender Studies. She is an associate professor and was former chairperson of the Department of Women and Development Studies, College of Social Work and Community Development of UP Diliman. She was also the director of the Doctor of Social Development Program of UPCSWCD. NATSI has a bachelor degree in economics from the University of London and a BA in philosophy, an MA in Women and Development Studies, and a doctorate in social development, all from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Her research and extension work are in the areas of gender and development and gender and economy. Natsi is the treasurer and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Likhaan Center for Women's Health, an organization focused on promoting the health and rights of women from marginalized communities. Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome Dr. Natsi Africa Verceles.
Maraming salamat po, Dr. Joanne Serrano. I thank the UPOU Gender Office for this opportunity to share my knowledge about gender responsive and feminist research. So magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. I hope we are all safe and doing well amidst the unrelenting COVID-19 pandemic. It is a pleasure for me to be virtually here with all of you and to discuss how we can end gender research, or how we can assimilate or incorporate gender considerations in our research. Now I'm going to share po my screen. Okay, so yan po ang pamagat ng aking presentation, Engendering Research. This is my presentation outline. I begin by locating engendered and feminist research within the broader field of social research, then segue to mainstream theorizing and feminist critiques of it. After this, I discuss the topic of integrating gender in our research projects and how to engender research in 5 phases. I end with a checklist for gender-sensitive research, which we should all be striving for at the very least. In the second portion, I make a case for feminist research, which I will define. I discuss feminist approaches to epistemology, ontology, and methodology. I provide an overview of some and elaborate on feminist epistemologies. I provide an overview of some methods feminist researchers use and delineate the principles of feminist research ethics. I end with an example of a feminist research. So I'm going to start with social research and mainstream theorizing. Social research is concerned about people and looks into people's beliefs, behaviors, interactions, and institutions. It is a structured, organized, and systematic process of knowledge production about the social world. Like all research, it combines assumptions about the nature of the world, or ontology, and knowledge, or epistemology, as well as rules, principles, procedures, techniques, and instruments for gaining knowledge, or methodology. It is in the research design where theory, ontology, and epistemology come together in formulating the research question and in selecting the research methodology and research methods. Now, what is theory? Theory is most commonly defined as scientific theory, which emphasizes a logically unified framework, generalization, and explanation. Social theory is a system of interconnected ideas that organizes knowledge about the social world. It is a generalization and explanation which helps us make sense of the social world. The traditional mainstream process of theorizing is based on the scientific method. This consists of the cycle of existing knowledge, a given set of assumptions, a statement of hypothesis, testing by collection of empirical data, coming up with general principles, and then development or revision of theory, leading to modified assumptions, which results in new knowledge. Studying women's work using the traditional process of theorizing could take this form. The assumption could be that women's work is biologically determined and should be home-based. The hypothesis would be the waged workforce is predominantly male. The information gathered to test the data, to test the hypothesis, would be limited to quantitative data, which are used to support the general principles. Indeed, we would see that the hypothesis, which is imbued with male bias, would be proven correct. If we, however, investigate women's work from a feminist perspective, we would find the following to also be true. Some women do unpaid work in the home. Some women do both unpaid work in the home and paid work. Some women do only paid work and hire other women to work in their homes. Women are found in a variety of occupations. Women work at all levels in the workplace. Women, both in unpaid and paid work, contribute to the national economy. Now, I will call attention to the problems associated with mainstream theorizing. It presumes that the researcher, the research process, and knowledge are value-free, objective, and neutral when there are, in fact, unrecognized and value-laden assumptions being made, which are based on the researcher's biases, as in the example that I gave about how women are predominantly home-based rather than in the productive workforce. Biases can affect the research process at every stage in problem identification, hypothesis formulation, research design, collection, analysis, and interpretation of data. There is an overemphasis on empirical and quantitative data and the denial of qualitative data. And lastly, there is a lack of involvement of the researcher with the subjects of the research or the research participants. In other words, the nature of the process is impersonal and detached. Now, I will now proceed to integrating gender into or engendering research projects. Okay. The research training that I have had is on feminist research. Until I became the director of the UP Center for Women's and Gender Studies, I used to teach feminist research classes in the Department of Women and Development Studies in UP Diliman. Now I only handle one class, the History and Perspectives of Women, Gender, and Development. My thesis and dissertation students who have graduated all conducted feminist research, and all the research studies I have done, been involved in, and currently doing are also feminists. So for the first part of this presentation, I had to study how to do research that is, shall I say, not just below feminist research. I will also add that integrating gender into our research projects assumes that we have at least some basic knowledge about the social construction of gender and the unequal power relations between women and men that ensue from this. Now, why should we engender research? Women continue to experience discrimination, exploitation, marginalization, oppression, and subordination in the various societal spheres. So that's what DEMO stands for. Gender relations are obstinately hierarchical, with more rights, privileges, and power allocated to men than to women. We also recognize that women are not homogeneous. They are differentiated by other social identities such as class, ethnicity, religion, ability or disability, age, sexual orientation, etc. It is those with multiple subordinated identities who are rendered most vulnerable because of intersecting structures of inequality. And gendering research will make it more accurate and ultimately more useful in influencing policy formulation and implementation if that is our intention. Strategically planned and executed research that takes into account women's and gender issues will also result in more thorough, participatory, and relevant results. Rather than think in terms of merely integrating gender into our research, we may want to take the perspective and approach of engendering our research instead. This entails the mainstreaming of the gender dimension into every component of the research, in particular, in identifying the problem, defining the conceptual and analytical frameworks, as well as the theoretical framework, choosing the methodology, analyzing and interpreting the data or the findings, and in disseminating the results. So these are the key features to include when engendering research. Focus on multiple elements such as beliefs, attitudes, perceptions, practices, and participation, access to, control, and ownership of resources, institutions, laws and policies, and it's highlighted, the power dynamics that influence these. Use an intersectional approach, going beyond men and women to include other identities such as class, ethnicity, religion, ability or disability, age, sexuality, etc. Consider multiple levels, such as individual, relational, such as household, community, markets, and structural, such as norms, policies, institutions, etc. Also, we could consider using multiple or mixed methods. According to the United Nations International Research and Training Institute for the Advancement of Women, or UN-INSTRA, these are the top 10 characteristics of gendered research. Gender roles and relations. So that means gender issues are taken into account throughout the entire research process. It is recognized that gender roles are socially constructed and there are unequal power relations between men and women as a result of these social roles, such as in access to, control over, and ownership of resources, as well as decision-making at the household, local, national, and international levels. Gender analysis. There is a systematic gathering and examination of data on gender differences and social relations in order to identify, understand, and redress injustices and inequalities based on gender at each stage of the research process. This is, of course, premised on the collection of sex disaggregated data. The third, gender versus women. Gender is differentiated from women, and it is understood that women are not homogeneous and are, again, differentiated by many other social identities. The fourth is inclusion and diversity. All the various stakeholders are involved and represented, and target groups, survey samples, etc. are as diverse as possible, with particular attention to including the voices of marginalized groups. Fifth, changing the research process. This means doing research in a way that empowers women through the use of participatory research methods and doing research with people rather than on them. The sixth is the critique of standard science and social science research theories and methods. There is the questioning of the concepts of objectivity and universality, valuing experiential knowledge, inclusion of emotion, contextualization, and self-reflexivity. The seventh is interdisciplinarity. Topics and methods are drawn from different academic fields with an emphasis on the multiple dimensions of social problems. The eighth is analysis of power hierarchies. Action is taken to address power inequalities between the researcher and research participants, as well as among the research participants. This includes the explicit acknowledgement of research agendas as political and a mindfulness about researcher subjectivity, co-authoring, if that's the case, participatory research methodologies, etc. The ninth is non-traditional qualitative research methods, which are used, such as life stories, personal histories, etc., that surface the voices of the research participants. The 10th is research as political action. This goes beyond doing research for the sake of increasing knowledge and information and seeing research as part of advocacy work towards transformative social change. Now I present the gender research rubric used by Oxfam. Using this, we can determine the extent to which we can or want to integrate gender in our research. So the first is gender blind, which we all want to avoid in all the social research that we do. So in gender blind research, gender is not considered in the research project, not even in its conceptualization or its rationale. Okay, the second is gender aware. Gender is considered in the research project's rationale, but it is not an operative concept in the design and methodology. In other words, it stops in the rationale section. Now, gender sensitive. Here, gender is considered in the research project's rationale, project design, and methodology. Data is disaggregated by gender, and gender is also considered in the composition of the research team and reviewers. Gender-sensitive research does not yet extend to analysis and action to address gender inequalities. The next research is gender responsive. Here, gender is considered in the research project's rationale, design, and methodology, and is rigorously analyzed with a view to inform implementation, communication, and influencing strategies. Gender responsive research does not yet address the underlying structural factors such as norms and power relations that contribute to gender inequalities. So the highest level po is gender transformative research. So here, an examination, analysis, etc. is done, and also there is a building of an evidence base to inform long-term practical changes in structural gender power relations and norms, roles, and inequalities. So gender transformative research should lead to sustained change through action, for example, through partnerships, outreach, and interventions, particularly with women's rights organizations. So using my dissertation as an example, which I will also be presenting at the end, and it's on feminist solidarity economics. And as an example of gender transformative research, 7 years later, since I defended it and graduated, I am still utilizing and building on the results through a sustained partnership with the Asian Solidarity Economy Council, or ASEC. So there have been several actions throughout the year, such as presentations on international social solidarity economy conferences, co-drafting of the Asian Solidarity Economy Council charter, which incorporated the recommendations of my dissertation, and active involvement in the Social Solidarity Economy Online Academy, which was established during the pandemic. Later this month, we will be piloting an online course on engendering the Social Solidarity Economy, which is a partnership between the UP Center for Women's and Gender Studies, UN Women, and the Asian Solidarity Economy Council. The following questions can serve as both a checklist and a guide with respect to the integration of gender into our research. I will start with gender-aware research, not gender-blind, because no social research, again, should be gender-blind. And then I will proceed to gender-sensitive, gender-responsive, and then gender-transformative research. Please note that the questions for each type of research builds on the questions of the previous one. And then I also highlighted po and changed the color of the type of research. So ito color blue po. So for gender-aware research, we ask, are you using appropriate terminologies and language? That is, are you avoiding terms or classifications that apply exclusively to one sex and reflect gender stereotypes such as housewife, fisherman, or using language that assumes only two genders such as the opposite sex or either gender, because as we know, there are many gender identities. For the background and rationale, does this research connect to any of the gender projects, campaigns, programs in your organization? Do you consider the gender dimensions of your research topic in its conceptualization? Do you consider how women may be differentially or disproportionately affected by the topic under consideration vis-a-vis men? For example, in a research on the effects of the pandemic, are we mindful that women and men will have different experiences? As to the dissemination, engagement, and influencing for internal audiences, will you share your report with the gender experts in your organization? So in your case, that would be the UPOU Gender Center. Now we move to gender sensitive research. And additionally, do you consider the gender specific risks associated with this research, and have you designed measures to mitigate against these risks? For instance, if sensitive issues such as violence against women are surfaced, are you equipped to handle possible distress from the research participants? Have you considered the gender balance in the project team? Are you collecting and using gender disaggregated data whenever possible to fully reflect women, girls, and members of gender diverse communities' experiences? Please note the inclusion of members of the LGBTQI community. Is there a research objective that identifies gendered barriers and seeks solutions? In other words, is there a concern for women's adverse experiences of a phenomenon because they are women, and an attempt to understand why in order to propose solutions? Do the research questions explicitly seek to uncover the experiences of women, men, girls, boys, and other gender diverse communities in relation to each other? In other words, are we going to look at the differences in their experiences? When thinking of the research or data gaps, do you engage with how gender may play a role in producing such gaps? For instance, are women's voices and experiences not being surfaced because it is only the male household heads who are interviewed? We're still on gender sensitive research po. Now, for the methodology, are women, men, and members of gender diverse communities considered in the sampling? We must also strive to be intersectional and consider the identities of class, age, ethnicity, income, education, and make attempts to reach out to a diverse population, especially those from socially excluded groups. Does the research use participatory or collaborative approaches or methodologies in the research process? That is, will the participants be engaged in the development of interview questions, in the conduct of interviews or focus group discussions, and/or validation workshops? For qualitative methods such as focus group discussions and interviews, are there gender-specific spaces? Mixed groups are okay, or they're acceptable, for as long as there's also an opportunity to have separate spaces for different genders. It is also recommended that these interviews be led by facilitators of the same gender. For quantitative methods, were issues pertinent to women and/or other gender diverse groups taken into account when developing indicators or categories? For instance, in studying the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, we should look at the intensification of women's reproductive burdens or the care work that they perform in households. For external audiences, will you reach out to women's organizations or LGBTQI organizations if appropriate? Now we move to gender responsive research. And again, these questions build on the previous questions. For quantitative and qualitative methods, are the data collection tools designed to take into account and challenge gender stereotypes and social and cultural factors that may introduce gender bias into the data? Examples of what we should avoid are collection of employment data that excludes informal and unpaid care work, where women are disproportionately represented. Questionnaires that consider men only as heads of households, questions that assume rather than challenge gender stereotypes by using terms such as, again, housewife or farmer or fisherman. Questions asked of proxy respondents, usually male heads of households, rather than the individuals themselves. So gender responsive research pa rin po. This entails doing a gender analysis already. As such, does the analysis draw out the critical similarities and differences between men's, women's, and members of gender diverse communities' experiences of the issue or problem? Does the analysis examine the gender and other dimensions of social groups? For example, does it further unpack women by examining the intersectionality of class, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, etc.? Are you presenting the experiences of different genders in a way that captures their diversity? That is by disaggregating gender differences into smaller categories of class, ethnicity, marital status, age, etc. And finally, for gender transformative research, which is what I hope we will all strive for, do you consider how social norms, power relations, and other structural factors underlying gender inequality affect your research topic, process, and participants? In other words, is there an overt recognition of asymmetrical power structures? Does your research analyze, recognize, and seek to transform unequal power relations between men and women and or other gender diverse groups? Is the intention to contribute to social transformation clear? How participatory is the research? Does the research strive for full and meaningful participation of different gender diverse and socially excluded groups as change agents during the different stages of the research cycle, including defining the research agenda, analysis, validation workshops, and use of the research results? Do the research questions explore the structural power relations that sustain gender inequalities in relation to the research topic? Do they seek possible solutions and mechanisms for change with the participants? Is there a research objective that identifies gendered barriers and seeks solutions? Will there be opportunities throughout the research cycle to be reflexive and aware of your own or our own gender assumptions, biases, and power as a researcher? Do the terms of reference, scope of work recognize gender identity as a spectrum and consider the needs of gender diverse communities? Does the research methodology enable critical learning, reflection, and questioning of gender inequality by all involved in the research process? Sa analysis naman po, does your power analysis consider gendered inequalities of power? What strategic approaches will be used for responding to them? Again, this entails knowledge of gender analysis frameworks. Madali naman pong aralin yan. Do the case studies highlight the initiative and agency of women, girls, and members of gender diverse communities? Are you explicitly challenging the harmful narratives around norms, power inequalities, patriarchy, and other structural factors that promote gender and also other social inequalities? Do the solutions and recommendations you identify seek to lessen the impacts of gender inequality and also to fundamentally change and end them? Are there women's organizations that can be partnered with for the purposes of your research? If so, have you reached out to them? Gender transformative research must be utilized by women's movement actors, of course. After going through the elements of gender transformative research, I believe that the concept of gender transformative research is useful as an exemplar, as it may be impractical to adhere to all the elements, such as, for instance, ensuring that it is fully participatory from the selection of the topic and the design of the research to the data collection, analysis, and interpretation, etc. However, the transformative agenda is non-negotiable. Now, I will talk about how to engender research in 5 phases. Phase 1, choosing research topics and objectives. This is from UN Instropo. Research with a gender perspective is participatory in nature, with special attention to all the stakeholders involved in and affected by the research process. Stakeholders will, of course, vary depending on the type of research conducted and may include other individuals in addition to the research participants and other community members. Women stakeholders, of course, should be included. Some gender-specific questions that can be asked at this point include, has previous research been conducted on the topic? We need to do that for our RRL, for our review of related literature. What were the gender-specific outcomes? How can I make sure that the women stakeholders are included in the research process and will benefit from the research outcomes? What might the policy implications of this research be? How might these policies affect men and women differently? Will the results as well as the process itself be empowering or disempowering for women? The process of formulating a research question is critical as it defines what information will be gathered and how, the stakeholders involved, and the potential impact of the research. Working from a gender perspective means that the researcher should consider how men and women are currently affected by and actively involved in the issue. The impacts of the outputs of the research upon women, men, girls, and boys, as well as on gender relations, also needs to be taken into account. Participation is also crucial at this stage as early involvement of research participants and other key stakeholders in the community will build trust among community members. Some gender-specific questions that can be asked at this stage include, whom does the issue currently affect? How does the issue affect men and women differently? How have women and men already taken action to address this issue? Who will be affected by this research? How will this research affect men and women differently? What previous research has been conducted on this topic? Did the research take gender dimensions into consideration? What sex disaggregated data is already available on this topic? So I added this spot to phase one. Let us please ensure gender-sensitive formulation of the research question. For example, how are men and women in UPOU currently affected by the COVID-19 pandemic? In defining a conceptual framework or of the framework that reflects the variables of the study and their interrelations, we should ensure that this reflects the experiences of both women and men. For example, in a hypothetical study entitled The Economic and Social Impacts of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Women and Men in UPOU, the variables and relationships between the variables should accurately reflect the realities of the lives of both women and men, and also gender diverse individuals. Now we'll move to phase two, choosing your methods. We must develop a gender sensitive methodology. In other words, the rules and principles that guide and inform how we go about the research must be gender sensitive. The appropriate methods for conducting research from a gender perspective are, like in all research studies, directly related to the research question and objectives. Quantitative data is most commonly collected by using standardized surveys. These are ways of incorporating a gender perspective into the survey design. Define target groups or the survey sample to take into account the diverse experiences of women, men, girls, and boys. When developing the survey questions, include the gender aspect of the research topic that were identified during the preliminary research, yung sa RRL, and also interviews with community members and other stakeholders. Questions should be formulated with sensitivity to both gender and cultural considerations, so in the wording and also in the phrasing. Qualitative methods and approaches are well suited to research with a gender perspective because they facilitate a more nuanced, textured, and personal approach to the issue. For open-ended interviews, select samples and utilize questions that will surface the diverse experiences of men and women. Allow for the full participation of the interviewee. For life stories, give the participant the freedom to discuss the issues that they feel are most important or vital to them, while also drawing out gender issues, of course. For focus group discussions, select group samples that will take into account the diverse experiences of men and women. Same-sex FGDs may be better because women will feel more comfortable speaking about certain topics without the presence of men. Ensure that the moderator has undergone a gender sensitivity training. Very important po yan. And then have a female moderator for a woman-only FGD and vice versa. For participant observation, pay close attention to the gender roles and gender relations in the community. How are these structured? How do they affect women's and men's different relationships to the issue under consideration? Use gender-sensitive research tools. In other words, these should not be threatening or embarrassing, and then select a convenient time and place for the data gathering. Be careful with the language used. Provide opportunities for women and men to present their points of view on the same subject. Now, on to phase 3, analyzing the data. Documenting differences based on gender does not automatically provide an understanding of gender issues. Very important po yan. Okay, just because we document gender differences doesn't mean that we are already enhancing understanding of the gender issues underlying them, or why there are differences in equities or inequalities. A gender analysis should explain the differences in experiences, viewpoints, and impacts related to gender roles and gender power relationships. In conducting a gender analysis, gender-specific questions that can be asked include: what gender differences can be observed in your research? How does the issue differently affect women and men? What power relations can be observed? So very important po yung question number 3. A gender analysis, just a quick overview po, entails looking at the following: the division of labor roles and responsibilities between men and women. And as we know, there's an unequal gender division of labor between women and men. Who is doing what and what is the link with the research topic? Women and men's access to, control over, and ownership of resources, such as natural resources, financial resources, information, decision-making processes, and intangible resources, etc. The power relations in the household, community, society, workplace, etc. The legal and social status of men and women. Hypotheses, analytical frameworks, and models must be based on reality, not on assumptions of gender roles and capacities. So we must be careful about prejudices regarding the capacities of men or women, or about which activities are better suited to one another, placing more value on men's contribution compared to women's in the same area, placing more value on women's work in the household while neglecting the value of women's work outside the household. We should recognize the full diversity of women's and men's experiences. And also, we should be reflexive about our own prejudices and biases towards men and women. Phase 4 po, communicating your results. Because gender research targets social transformation, the clear communication of research findings is a critical part of the research process. Depending on the main audience and intended use of the research findings, the communication of research results can take different forms. While the most common form is the written report, research findings can also be presented in a more popular form, such as infographics and short videos. Effective communication of research findings can be vital to the creation of political will or the commitment to address and resolve a specific problem. Research findings can also raise public awareness or even change public opinion on vital gender issues if they are communicated effectively. In reporting the findings, We must, of course, highlight the gender dimension by making visible the gender differences, different roles, involvements, experiences, opinions, needs of women and men. It should also provide as much visibility to women's contributions and experiences as men's. And of course, we must be careful in using language. So we should ensure that we use gender fair language in writing our research reports. And lastly, reflexivity and lessons learned. This is the fifth and last phase. We ask the following questions. How successful were your chosen methods in assessing the breadth of the problem and its gender components? Are there other methods that you would include in a similar project? How successful were you in getting the community involved? Were equal numbers of women and men involved? If not, what steps might you take to change this in future research projects? Did you uncover any gender-related issues in your research that need further study? What types of change can be observed in your research participants? How has the research impacted, if at all, the lives of women, the lives of men, and gender relations in general? Anticipate the impacts of new policies or practices on men and women in terms of who will benefit from these, who will be disadvantaged, what are the impacts on men's and women's activities and relations with each other. So this is the reference for the next slide, which provides a useful checklist in ensuring that our research is at the very least gender sensitive. I don't know if you can read it, but I'm going to read it aloud anyway. So for applying a gender-sensitive approach in research at the minimum, the following should be taken into consideration. Are you considering increasing diversity of your project team? Hindi lang yan according to sex, kundi other social identities. No? Are you deterring hierarchical gendered relations in your team? Are you discouraging gender segregation in your team? Are the working conditions within the project shaped in a way that accommodates men and women equally? Did you have both men and women in mind when you formulated the research question? Have you checked if men and women are differently related to the research problem you want to deal with? Have you looked for gender-sensitive studies while preparing the literature review for the research? Have you checked if you are projecting stereotypical gender roles? Do you have male and female specimens in your research sample? Is your methodology tackling the issues relevant to both women and men? Is the language you are using gender sensitive or gender fair? Do you disaggregate data by sex? Do you have equal number of both sexes genders in your sample? Do you report data in a gender sensitive way? Have you checked how different genders will use the project results? Will the project results benefit the lives of both women and men? And does your research relate to gender inequalities in society? Now, I will proceed to the discussion on feminist research. Feminist research is gender transformative research and more. So it's feminist research plus plus, because it also utilizes feminist epistemological, ontological, methodological, and ethical perspectives. So why do we need feminist research? Much of our understanding of the world, our societies, and ourselves rests on theories and knowledge generated by men of certain nationalities and classes. It is men who have dominated theorizing, knowledge production, and generation. Knowledge that is based mainly on a male, culturally specific experience represents a skewed perception of reality and is only partial knowledge. Women and other marginalized sectors have epistemic marginality because of their exclusion from theorizing and knowledge building. The result is that women's contributions to society, women's concerns and issues, and women's perspectives have been ignored. There is a need to rectify the marginalization of women in mainstream research by taking women's experiences into account using feminist approaches to theory and knowledge building. The goal is to change women's lives for the better. Now, what is feminist research? Feminist research is framed by feminist theories and generates theories using feminist lenses. It is knowledge building, generation, construction, production for women's empowerment, gender justice, and gender equality. Feminist research surfaces and understands women's demos, yung in-elaborate ko po kanina, in society. And it aims to change the conditions adversely affecting women's lives by critically examining existing theories and developing new policies and social action. It challenges gender inequalities and confronts unequal power relations in both knowledge building and in women's lives. Feminist research recognizes that the category women is pluralistic and that factors other than gender shape perceptions and understandings and even experiences, such as class, race, ethnicity, disability, religion, sexual orientation, age, etc. In other words, it uses an intersectional approach in understanding women's lives. It promotes gender and other forms of social justice. It is important to make the point that feminist research is not identified by the subjects of the study, as merely studying women's experiences does not make the research automatically feminist. Feminist research is identified by a commitment to producing knowledge useful in exposing gender and other forms of injustice. It does not rationalize oppressive constructions of gender, such as male dominance and female subordination. And it is explicit about its ethical and political stance. Lastly, feminist research highlights women's experiences and knowledge. It is the conduct of research for women, where there is interaction between the researcher and the research subject, who are also called research participants. And efforts are made to establish non-hierarchical relationships. Expressions of feelings and emotions and a concern for values are not seen as contaminants to the research, and great care is taken to use non-sexist language. Now I will discuss feminist approaches to epistemology, ontology, and methodology, starting with epistemology, which, as we all know, refers to the theory of knowledge. It is concerned about what qualifies as knowledge and what is considered valid, legitimate, authoritative, reliable knowledge. Later, I will elaborate on 3 feminist epistemological perspectives. For now, I will say that the personal, experiential, and emotional aspects of experience and the understandings of the research participants are given value. All these qualify as sources of knowledge. Ontology refers to the theory of reality or being and is the foundation of knowledge. It is concerned about what exists in reality. Feminist ontology in particular considers the interplay of gender and power. Reality is found in women's concrete and diverse everyday experiences and is located within unequal social structures, again, based not only on gender, but also other social identities. Methodology refers to the theory of how knowledge building should proceed. It covers the rules and principles that guide and inform how one goes about the research. The feminist methodology is both ethical, and I will elaborate on this later when I discuss feminist research ethics, and political, because it examines unequal power relations. There are efforts to build a non-hierarchical relationship with research participants and a mindfulness that power influences the processes of knowledge production. Okay. The feminist methodology is also concerned about issues of representation, or knowing, speaking, and advocating for others, which implies the need for greater care and responsibility. Reflexivity, or a critical awareness of one's social location, subjectivity, positionality, power, and how these influence the research process. Parenthetically, reflexivity extends to all other influences on the research. So theoretical, epistemological, ontological, everything, interpersonal, institutional, okay. Transparency and accountability in knowledge construction, and ethical practices in the stages of design, data gathering, analysis, interpretation, and publication. We validate our data with our research participants and share the research findings with them. Efforts are also made to popularize the research or to present them in a format that make them more understandable to people who will benefit from the knowledge product. Now I will proceed to the feminist research epistemologies using what is called the classic tripartite taxonomy of Sandra Harding, namely feminist empiricism, feminist standpoint theory, and feminist postmodernism. I will begin with feminist empiricism. Of all the feminist epistemologies, it is feminist empiricism which hews closest to the mainstream approach. It is connected to both the feminist perspective and positivist approaches and aims to integrate feminist political goals in empiricist research. Its methodology remains grounded in what the senses can know and what the methods can measure. It believes that the social world can be understood and that it is possible to produce truthful and objective knowledge using positivist tools. It speaks from within the establishment because, as we know, statistics are convincing to those in power. However, feminist research critiques the practices and output of the traditional scientific establishment that render women invisible or misrepresent their experiences. It does not question the research values of objectivity and value neutrality in traditional research. It just makes it better by correcting for male bias. Through empirical research, women's experiences and perspectives that have been neglected by male theorists are made visible using the methodology and methods acceptable to mainstream researchers. Feminist empiricism asserts that women's experiences and perceptions lead to knowledge that is more comprehensive and less biased. It examines how gender and other power relations, such as those based on class, race, etc., and other identities, affect women's lives and seeks knowledge that benefits women and accurately represents their experiences. Feminist empiricism uses feminist lenses and a critical perspective to produce more objective knowledge and includes gender, culture, and context in quantitative survey methods under the belief that the social and political context is measurable and observable. Now we proceed to feminist standpoint. Feminist standpoint is inspired by the Marxist standpoint, wherein the working class is epistemically privileged. It sees knowledge as constructed in specific historical circumstances by particular social groups and embodying those groups' values and interests. So it's very contextual po. The standpoint is not equated with existing beliefs and attitudes, as there is the recognition that these can be distorted by dominant systems of knowledge and structure. So there might be a false consciousness, in other words. The feminist standpoint grants epistemic authority to those discredited as knowers. They are said to have the epistemic advantage of an insider-outsider perspective or a double consciousness, as they have an understanding of the worlds of both the oppressor and the oppressed. Women's concrete experiences are the starting point for building knowledge. It challenges us to see the world through the eyes of oppressed women and to apply this knowledge towards social transformation. The feminist standpoint does not claim that the oppressed have automatic knowledge of social reality, only that a certain location may facilitate or block the achievement of insights. The standpoint is discovered and achieved through collective political engagement and struggle, which is fueled by a shared critical consciousness about unequal power structures. It is knowledge that is epistemically superior to men's because it is more impartial, represents the interests of society as a whole, and is more inclusive and comprehensive. It is important, again, to note that particular social locations confer epistemic advantage only with respect to particular research projects. So feminist standpoint does not assert that the oppressed are infallible, even on their own oppression, or that they are authorities in everything. Important po yung proviso na yan. And now finally, feminist postmodernism. Feminist postmodernism rejects the very possibility of a truth about reality. It takes the position of deep skepticism about universal claims and a commitment to plurality, so multiple perspectives and truths. It rejects totalizing grand narratives or social theories that are believed to stand anytime, anywhere, like such as those asserted by positivist researchers, some of which contribute to the marginalization of women and essentialize difference. It believes that all observers are situated in a specific political, economic, cultural, and historical context, and that all perspectives are partial. Researchers can only tell a story that is partial and perspectival, one story among many other stories. Instead of grand narratives, postmodernism proposes a study of difference and the relationship between power and knowledge. It is reflexive and highly sensitive to power and the power relations that shape the processes of knowledge production, to how power operates in the construction of meta-narratives. Feminist postmodernism is interested in determining how what is considered knowledge becomes such, and what the effects of this knowledge are. Rather than specify what counts as authoritative knowledge, it interrogates how some forms of knowledge become more authoritative than others. Knowledge is seen as socially constructed, rather than the discovery of a natural order of being. Foucault saw knowledge as discursive constructs, not as representing an underlying reality. So knowledge is created through language, according to Foucault. Feminist postmodernism uses discourse, or a way of specifying what counts as knowledge, which consists of concepts, categories, and beliefs, as primary objects of analysis to heighten our understanding of the relations between power and knowledge. Deconstruction is used to examine hidden assumptions behind particular bodies of theory and practice. Postmodernism is concerned with the interconnection of language or texts, knowledge, and power. Knowledge, of course, is articulated through language or text, and that can be visual. And it is power that determines what knowledge is. Discourses are seen as regimes of power which promote specific interests. So some interests are served by particular constructions of reality. Discourses can be challenged and changed. Hegemonic discourses should be challenged by subjugated knowledge. Postmodern thought opens possibilities for the surfacing of subjugated voices. Feminist postmodernism challenges feminism's tendency to universalize and naturalize. The categories woman, man, masculinity, and femininity have meaning only in the context of historically contingent and culturally specific discourses which construct social realities. In other words, things exist only insofar as they are constructed through language and discourse. Feminist postmodernism thus gives rise to the conundrum that patriarchy and feminism are thus not generally valid and are merely representative of one mode of thinking. And women's emancipation and empowerment can be seen as grand narratives. Okay, now I will go to an overview of some research methods feminist researchers use. So these are some of the research methods that we use as feminist researchers. You will note that these are also used by other social researchers. The difference being that their utilization is informed by feminist research ethics, which I will subsequently discuss. So we utilize interviews such as key informant structured and semi-structured interviews where an individual is questioned in order to surface their experiences, opinions, beliefs, practices, behaviors, etc. Surveys, which is a research activity which consists of asking questions of a representative cross-section of the population. It involves a survey instrument, respondents, and interviewers. Life story, which is storytelling by women of events throughout their life cycle. Feminist ethnography entails living with, interviewing, and observing a group of people to describe their way of life or the context of a social phenomenon. It looks at the political, economic, social, and cultural features of the community. Observation and participant observation is used to collect data on behavior and events, physical and material aspects of social life. It ranges from complete observer to complete participant observation and is used to complement and validate data from interviews and secondary data. And then we also have the focus group discussion, which is a dynamic, open, and democratic manner of surfacing the concerns of a group of participants with a moderator. It facilitates the critical consciousness raising and solidarity among women, women speaking up, expressing themselves, and sharing their experiences. It is a social gathering for women which provides an opportunity for them to be away from their daily concerns. Now I'll go to feminist research ethics. Feminist research ethics are a set of principles that guide the conduct of feminist researchers in relation to the research participants, funding agencies, their institutions, to each other, and the reader. They are adhered to in order to produce responsible, accountable, and self-reflexive research. A premium is placed on HAT, honesty, accountability, transparency. I use that kasi for my research students, so it's easy for them to remember. Or I always say, wear your research hat, okay? And then I added humility. I tell also my research students that our research participants are the experts of their own experiences. I myself have been asked by research participants before an interview if the questions are difficult. Mahirap ba? I reassure them by saying that they know more than I do about their experiences, and that if I were the expert and knew everything, I would not be there doing the interview with them. Feminist research ethics requires the following: benefits and reciprocity. Research studies serve the interests of the most oppressed groups. The foremost benefit is breaking their silence, surfacing subjugated voices. And there is reciprocity in terms of giving back, in terms of services or materials. For my own dissertation, I made a donation to the organizations that participated in my research after I had finished my data gathering. Informed consent is the right to be asked for consent to participate in the research and to be fully informed about the research. Privacy and confidentiality. So privacy is the right to determine when, how, and to what extent information is shared with or withheld from others. Confidentiality means that private data identifying the subjects will not be reported without their consent. Establishment of non-hierarchical relationships, which entails efforts made towards ensuring that the researcher does not exercise power over the research participants. Commitment to the liberatory goal of feminist research. So the study should produce knowledge that can alter oppressive and exploitative conditions in society. Self-reflexivity is an awareness of how our gender, class, religion, etc. affect the entire research process in topic selection, research design, data gathering, analysis, interpretation, etc. Ethics in processing data, very important one, given that the researcher alone has sole access to and total control over recordings and transcripts. And then politics and hierarchy in the institution, which entails recognizing the invisible work of other contributors to the research. Okay, now this is my example po. I will be presenting just an excerpt of my 2014 doctoral dissertation entitled Livelihood Practices of Women in the Informal Economy, Forging Pathways Towards a Feminist Solidarity Economy. In the next 12 slides, I will be showing photographs of women from my 3 case study organizations, starting with Indigenous women who are members of the cooperative of Women in Health and Development, and they are based in Lake Cebu, South Cotabato. So they weave, embroider, do beadwork, and produce handicrafts. Now, these are the members of the National Network of Informal Workers in the Philippines, or PATAMABA. I particularly worked with the Santa Barbara, Iloilo chapter. So these are their members, some of them. They produce hats, bags, and slippers made of recycled flexible foil pouches, the ones used as containers for juice drinks. So kami po yan. And then these are the members of Kilos Foundation. Kababaihan, iisa ang layunin, umunlad ang sambayanan. So they are based in Pasig City. So they also produce bags and other products made of recycled flexible foil pouches. I will limit my presentation only to the following elements of my dissertation. Okay. The general objective was to determine how and to what extent participation in solidarity economics livelihood projects addresses the systematic subordination experienced by women in the informal economy, in reproduction, production, and in their relations with nature, and in various institutional settings, and to identify areas for improvement. The specific objectives were to identify solidarity economy initiatives initiated by low-income women based on adherence to the goals and values of solidarity economics, to study the processes, viability, and sustainability of these solidarity economics initiatives, surface the continuing and intersectional nature of the subordination of women workers in the informal economy within the context of neoliberal globalization, to determine whether and to what extent the other segments of the supply chain within which women's production is embedded are animated by solidarity principles, to determine how feminist economics critiques of mainstream economics and neoliberalism are or can be better addressed by solidarity economics initiatives, and to recommend policies that will promote and support a feminist solidarity economy. So this is the significance of the research po. Given the nascency of the solidarity economics paradigm in the Philippines, this research is a contribution to furthering and deepening an understanding and appreciation of it based on existing practices by women in the informal economy. It links the relatively new paradigm of solidarity economics with feminist visions of an alternative economy and delineates the contours of a feminist solidarity economy. It is a study that is rooted in the lives and voices of grassroots women and which integrates the social and political dimensions of their lives with the economic. The research is a contribution to the efforts of women worldwide to advance and claim economic and social justice for women of the South. So syempre may limitations po yung research. It was obviously premised on the specificity of individual women's experiences and realities, even within similar contexts, given that women's condition and position are a function of intersectional identities and other differentiating social factors. So at the outset, generalizability is limited. This, however, does not diminish the value of the research in terms of providing insights into the dynamics of the multiple subordination that women, informal workers from the South confront, their experiences as members of solidarity organizations and participants of solidarity livelihood projects, and the effects of their membership and participation in these organizations and projects. The research was based on only 3 case studies, which may not be representative of the range of solidarity economy initiatives already practiced by women on the ground. So ito po yung methodology ko. So it was focused on women and the informal economy, specifically self-employed, on-account, micro-entrepreneurs, and subcontracted workers. 3 case studies in 3 field sites were accomplished, and these covered in each of the field sites the Solidarity Livelihood Project, its women participants, and the supply chain within which production is embedded. The study was only qualitative, hindi po mixed methods, and utilized the research methods of participant observation, semi-structured interviews, and focus group discussions. The research methodology of course, was feminist, guided by feminist beliefs and concerns with the aim of transforming and empowering women. This research endeavored to generate knowledge about women that will contribute to their liberation and empowerment, improve women's daily lives, and influence public policies and opinions. This was my conceptual framework, wherein I combined feminist economics perspectives and solidarity economy perspectives. So yung feminist economics, really just here, quickly lang po, calls attention to how orthodox economics disregards women's gendered realities. So it aims to improve women's economic conditions. So yun po yung, what follows are the critiques that feminist economists have made of orthodox economics. And then, ito naman yung solidarity economics. So this is an alternative socio-economic order where all economic activity prioritizes meeting the needs of people and ecological sustainability rather than the maximization of profits. It is grounded on solidarity and cooperation and not the pursuit of narrow individual self-interest, and promotes economic democracy and alternative models of local economic governance, equity, and sustainability. So I see feminist solidarity economics as incorporating feminist perspectives on gender and the economy and redressing women's adverse gender-specific experiences of mainstream economic processes. So it is inclusive towards women and is responsive to both their practical gender needs and their strategic gender interests. For my theoretical framework, I use Neila Kabir's social relations approach. That's a gender analysis framework po, merged with Bina Agarwal's feminist environmentalism. So for the first institutional analysis, I used the merged frameworks to determine the systematic nature of the subordination of women in the informal economy across the institutions of the household, community, market, and state, and in the utilization of environmental resources. I looked at the dimensions of rules or the norms and values, human material and intangible resources, activities or the tasks that are performed, people or the patterns of inclusion and exclusion, placement and progress, and power or the relations of authority and control across these institutional sites. In the second institutional analysis, I utilized the social relations approach to determine how participation in the Solidarity Livelihood Project countered the subordination of women across the same dimensions through its own practices. In the third institutional analysis, I determined how the Solidarity Livelihood Project affected relations, power relations po yan, within the household, community, market, and with the state. And lastly, I also conducted a supply chain analysis to determine to what extent the various segments of the supply chain of the Solidarity Livelihood projects were animated by solidarity economics values. I looked at investment, input supply, production, that's where the livelihood project is, distribution, and consumption. So, yun na po, maraming salamat po. And these are my references for the first portion of my presentation and for the second portion. So thank you very, very, very much po.
Yeah. Maraming salamat po, Ma'am Natsi. Thank you very much po. So I believe, I know that a lot of our participants have questions. So for our guidelines lang po sa ating question and answer portion. So ayan po, for our Zoom participants, you may, when asking your question, please introduce yourself with your name and office unit. Raise your hand so that our technical team may unmute you. And then please feel free to turn on your camera when asking your questions po. You may also use the Zoom chat to type out your questions. So meron po akong nakitang question later. So maybe I'll read them out later din po. Tapos, Tapos for our live participants po, let me just remind you, please feel free to use yung comment sections po ng inyong live stream area. So kunyari po nasa Facebook kayo or YouTube or UPOU Networks website, please feel free to do so po. Sorry, nagkaano siya. So ayun po. So siguro po, hintayin ko na lang po muna. Baka meron pong gustong mag-raise ng hand nila dito sa ating Zoom chat. Kung meron man po, ay sa ating Zoom.
Majet, meron tayong question, Majet, dito sa ating Zoom
Ayan,
chat.
sige po. Sa chat na lang po muna siguro. So question po from Carl Marcos, what can you say about cisgender men doing feminist research or research involving an all-female participant?
Okay, that is a good question. And I'm glad that came up early in the discussion. I have male I had, when I used to teach the class, I had male feminist research students because they were our women in development studies majors, and they had to take, of course, our feminist research class. And I would like to think that men are able to do feminist research because but you need to very strictly adhere to the feminist research ethics, and you really need to understand everything that I presented on feminist research, the epistemological, ontological, methodological, ethical perspectives. So yes, I believe that men can do research, and I don't think it's going to be easy for them, especially when conducting interviews or focus group discussions. So perhaps it would help if they had a woman co-researcher or assistant to moderate the discussions or to do the interviews. I'll tell you why I feel so strongly that we should not be prejudicial towards men or cisgender men who do feminist research. Kasi, for instance, you looked at my dissertation, I did research on low-income women. I am not a low-income woman. Hindi po ba? So if we say that men should not do research on women because they are men, then we should also likewise question my identity as a privileged woman doing research on low-income women. Diba? So really, I think we just need to be constantly reflexive. Yung reflexivity, very important po yun. Yung mindfulness about flattening power relations, even if I know that's perhaps impossible to attain, but their effort should be made. No? Yung humility, yung hat na sinasabi ko, no? Yung humility, yung accountability, transparency, honesty. So I think, yes, in short, men can do feminist research, but with very, very great care. Okay, in the same way that those of us who do research with individuals of other subordinated identity should also exercise great care. So I hope I answered your question.
Thank you very much po. I'm inviting po yung ating pong Zoom participants. Maybe meron po kayong question for our resource speaker. Ayun po. Pwede po ba ako? Singit lang po
of
ako ng
course.
question.
Majet, sige, tanong tayo, Majet.
Meron po kasi akong very interesting po yung yung sa kapag po merong tawag doon, focus group discussion, yung moderator po dapat meron silang nag-umattend sila ng GST or gender sensitivity training. So would you have a recommended na parang minimum requirement of topics or hours nung gender sensitivity training na yun? Kasi ayun, marami po ngayon nagsusulputan ng GST training that covers different topics. Yeah. Ayun po.
Well, I don't think naman we have to be strict kasi pwede namang that person could have undergone many, many hours of training and still not understand as opposed to another person who might have less hours. So I don't think we can use number of hours as a criterion. So basta kailangan nakapag-GST. Actually, minsan nga isipin mo hindi naman kailangan nakapag-GST. Basta marunong lang. Diba? In other words, steeped in gender issues. Kasi that person could also be interested on their own, di ba? Oh. So, baka nagbabasa-basa rin, di ba? Or baka marami na ring alam. So, hindi naman kailangan. Pero kailangan naiintindihan yung gender issues, di ba? Yung unequal power relations, etc. I mean, understands what patriarchy is, etc. The social construction of gender. I mean, just the very basic concepts that we teach in gender sensitivity training.
Okay. Thank you very much po. Ayun, meron po akong nakitang nag-raise ng hand, si Ma'am Jean Saludes. Saludes po, yes po. May I invite you po to unmute and maybe open your camera din po.
Hello. Good
Hi,
afternoon,
ma'am.
Dr. Berceles. Yes,
Magandang hapon po.
magandang hapon. I'm from the Faculty of Management and Development Studies at MBS, and also currently the Vice Chancellor for Finance and Administration of the university. I'd like to commend you, Dr. Berceles, for a very comprehensive lecture. There's a lecture
Thank
that
you,
I'd like
ma'am.
my students to hear, in particular the hat, and I emphasize really humility when they go to field work. That's very important. I just like to just a comment, not really a question, because I did not see in the list of methods that can be used for data collection, the use of naturally occurring data. Especially in this time of pandemic, we cannot go to the field, and because of the issue of health protection from infection. Yeah. So I'm thinking of adding to the list the use of naturally occurring data. For instance, what the women are posting in their the Facebook accounts, and what they are exchanging with each other through the messenger, and all other medium and platforms, social media platforms. Just a comment. Yeah. As an
Thank you
addition.
very much, ma'am. That's a very important point to make, ma'am. Yes, you're right, because there are restrictions in terms of gathering data in the time of a pandemic. But when we utilize data from publicly available platforms, we also have to be mindful about the privacy, I think, of the individual. So baka kailangan po ng consent to utilize the data, and they have to be anonymized. So they have to be informed, and they have to be anonymized. Also, I'll say that some of the methods, the traditional methods that we use, can also be transitioned to online use. For instance, we can conduct naman semi-structured interviews online, or even focus group discussions, and we've done that already. And I'll also share that one of our large research projects currently in the center uses arts-based methods of movement, literary arts, and also visual arts. And we have already piloted them online. So it's a challenge, because it's not the same as obviously doing these methods on a face-to-face basis. But I am just saying that we can also consider ways of transitioning more traditional or even non-traditional methods like arts-based methods online. Kasi wala rin tayong choice. Hindi po ba?
Yeah, and especially in the context of EPOU, because our students are scattered all over the world. You know, they don't come to the campus, and even our staff are not located here in the headquarters here in Los Baños. Even our staff are scattered across the archipelago. So the importance of that kind of data collection, the method. Well, it's just a method, but that's something that I think is important to be able to gather data.
Ma'am, siguro abante yung UPOU, basta online modes, di ba? So you have that advantage which you should maximize because of your facility with online methods. All of us just had to gain quick expertise on using online methods kasi nga napuwersa tayo ng pandemic, di po ba? Pero kayo, you have an edge already in UPOU.
We should be able to contribute. Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Really
Thank you very much
your
po,
lecture.
ma'am. Thank you po, ma'am. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Ayan, thank you very much po. Baka meron pa po tayong questions. You may raise your hands, or sa atin din pong live stream, pwede rin po kayo mag-add ng questions if ever meron po kayo. Ayan po. Hi, Ma'am Joanne. Meron pong question si Ma'am Joanne.
Si Ma'am Jo.
Hi, Ma'am Nancy. Actually, this is a very basic question for our ongoing research right now. Kasi you have mentioned about heads of households. So we actually we have an ongoing research wherein one of our respondents would be the head of households, and there's always that assumption that heads of households are the male. The in a patriarchal society that we live in. So when you talk of household heads, they're always the father or the male in the family. So you have mentioned earlier about the construction of this reality in the as a household head. So in our research, should we assume that the household head should always be the male, and how, if not, how do we define that particular head of the household? Should we ask them? But of course, they would always say it's the father, because that's the structure that our society have.
Yes. Uh, we should never assume that the household head is automatically a man. So that's, I think, the number one rule. And we should actually find out from the person that we see when we visit the house who the household head is. Kasi in many cases, the woman is the household head, even if there is a man in her life, because that man could be an overseas Filipino worker, etc. Hindi po ba? Or they could be separated, or hindi nakatira doon yung lalaki, hindi po ba? So there are many cases where women are household heads. So I think maganda ho tanungin kung sino ang kinoconsider nilang household head. Pero meron kasi dapat na, I think, criteria as to whether that person would be the household head. Kasi normally we think in terms of sino yung primary breadwinner. Hindi po ba? Kasi normally kung sino yung primary breadwinner, siya yung kinoconsider na household head. Diba? Kasi the primary breadwinner would also be, in many instances, the primary decision maker as well. So yun po. So Ma'am Jo, ano talaga? Let's not omit the possibility that there may be female household heads. So let's just not automatically assume that it's the man who's the household head. Kasi minsan hindi rin naman yung asawa, di ba? What if there are other men? Kasi let's say extended household. Kung wari, father-in-law, di ba, ng babae. Dahil siya yung lalaki, siya ba yung i-consider natin household head because he's the man. So we really need to make sure that we are talking to the correct household head.
Okay po. Thank you very much po. Meron po tayong questions from our live stream participants. From Kim Cabrera Rivera. I am currently proposing a research on double burden of female teachers on the new normal pandemic, particularly women who have young 1 to 3 children. Can you suggest on ways how I can enhance to engender the study?
You need to engender it because you're studying women, right? Wala kang choice. I'm not sure if you attended the Women's and Gender Studies Association of the Philippines conference last week. There was a paper like that in the panel that I moderated. They studied the multiple burdens of women. And interesting, not only did they have young children and were they working, but they were also graduate students. So they were teachers and graduate students at the same time. So yeah, well, you need to, I mean, there are many considerations, of course, no? So in particular, can I hear from her? Because ang dami kong pwedeng ibigay na advice, pero I want to know, gusto kong tumbukin exactly what will be useful to her. Who was that again, Majet?
Si
Nandito
Kim
ba sa
Cabrera Rivera. I think sa live stream po siya.
Sa live stream. So, but there are so many ways, I mean, to engender the research. I mean, I don't know where to start. I mean, it will take me the whole afternoon, but I need to see how she framed her research problem, and I need to see the research objectives.
Mhm.
also, and then also the methods that she'll use. Is she also going to be considerate of the women's time, because they're multiple burdened already as it is, so they're going to take time off to be interviewed. So everything we need to take into consideration, the gender roles, gender stereotypes, and equal gender division of labor, and equal power relations between her and her partner, her access to control and ownership of resources that can help her. What are the activities that she performs in addition to what you already stated, etc. So there are many, many, many considerations. Ano yung um, norms, surrounding the institutions that she's going to be studying? Is it just the family, also the workplace ba, etc.? So yeah, many things to take into consideration when you engender research, but you need to have a working knowledge of gender analysis framework. So that's my first suggestion. You could look at the social relations approach that I utilize for my research. Yeah. Oh, and there are
Ayan.
simpler ones as well.
Okay po. Okay po. So, ayun po. Thank you for that po. Then maybe we have last two questions na lang po.
No, there's an important question here about whether
Yes
my
po.
participants, they know, they know. And in fact, they actually allowed me to use their names in my dissertation, but I made them anonymous. Yeah. So yeah, kasi nga we always need to ask permission.
Mhm. Ayan. Okay po. And then,
But for the webinar, but they knew that it was, kasi I've been also presenting this study in conferences, so they knew that I was presenting the photo. So hindi ko na tinanong yung specific webinar na to, but my assumption is because I was allowed to use them in foreign conferences and other presentations, that it would also apply to a webinar. Okay. May question pa?
Opo. Tapos meron din po naka-PM sa akin. Pero sige po, can queer people use the feminist postmodernist approach in research po?
Yes. Yes. And not just queer individuals, any individual who wants to interrogate the construction of knowledge, diba? And truth can use. And I know that feminist postmodernism is very appealing to queer individuals because of the fluidity, diba? Of truth. Very flexible kasi yung postmodern theory. So yes, of course, I recommend it. Kasi queerness is in a way also very fluid, di ba? And indeterminate and diverse and complex, just like postmodern thinking is.
Okay po. So siguro po for our last question from LJ Navallo Belaya. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Good afternoon. I am currently working my research proposal po kasi, and medyo nahihirapan kami sa mga review literature about gender. Since part of our study, livelihood program, is to include gender lens. Do you have any recommendations for gender references po? Thank you.
On livelihood, ang dami kasi, anong sector? I need more specifics, because when you talk about women's livelihoods, that is so broad. Like, I studied women in the informal economy. That's a topic that has to do with livelihood. So, have you tried Google Scholar? And then also the databases. Marami namang databases. Are you looking for Philippine studies? This is how I Google. I put PDF. I put the keywords and then I type PDF after. And then I only get papers rather than gray literature. So yun po.
Sorry, baka pwede ba po tayong maghabol? I'm seeing po that...
Aga pa.
Opo. I'm seeing po that Ma'am Wen po has raised her hand. Tama po ba yun? May I invite Ma'am Wen?
Hello, thank you, Majid. Good afternoon, Dr. Verceles. First of all, I'd like to let you know, I'm Assistant Professor Wen Raimundo. I'm with the Faculty of Education. I teach courses in Master of Distance Education, but I'm also an OBGYN. And I must first commend you for your very, very engaging and informative talk, especially the engaging way you delivered it. My question has to do with research. Some of our students are interested in doing research on gender equality in terms of education. But there's so much has been written about the Philippines ranking relatively higher in terms of gender parity, gender equality in Asia, for instance. Although we dropped several notches for 2020, parang ang impression pa rin is that, especially for in the Philippines, that women are more educated, parang mas lamang, ganyan. But this, can you comment on this? Being women being more educated really equate to they being more there being more gender equality in terms of education, especially in the Philippines? And is there what aspects of gender equality or in education in terms of feminist research can they go into, given that background na laging sinasabi in the Philippines hindi naman ganun ka huli ang babae in terms of education?
Mm. Yeah, it's a good question. I know that you're referring to the Global Gender Gap Report, and we dropped to 17th place from 16th place last year. But prior to that, we were in the top 10, and we are still number one in Asia, but number two in
Yes.
Asia Pacific, next to New Zealand. Yeah. Okay. As with respect to gender equality, yeah, they look at male-female educational attainment in the Global Gender Gap Report. Diba? So that's educational, how women perform vis-a-vis men. And we're really in parity na. Diba? So, and that is also the reason why we still rank so highly despite our more dismal performance in the other indicators, particularly yung political empowerment. Diba? So
Yes.
I think it's not enough though, yes, because women could be, and it has been shown that more women graduate from high school, university, and postgraduate studies than do men. Pero what do they do after they graduate? Right?
Exactly.
That's why
Yeah.
we need to look. We also need to look at the other indicator, which is economic participation and opportunity. So what do they do with what they learn in school?
Okay.
So you could have gender parity in education, but if women are just principally oppressed, exploited in the home, then we are not actually maximizing that result of gender parity in education. And then when we look at gender, this is the second part of your question. When we consider gender equality in education, I don't think we only look at who have graduated, how many women vis-a-vis men have graduated in these various levels, but also what are they studying, which fields are they in, because we hear that women are still marginalized in the STEM or the STEAM courses, diba? Or in fields where there is that fields or in areas of study that lead to higher income jobs, for instance, diba? Because women are still concentrated in fields that are lower paying, no? As connected to the academic. Kumare, teaching, di ba? Mababa lang yung sahod niya, di ba? Versus, sabihin nating architect,
Yeah.
di ba? Or
True.
engineer na male-dominated. So that's how we could go beyond what is in the statistics, di ba? In terms of, let's look at outcomes. No? And also, yan yung way of parang, parang unpacking, when we unpack the gender dimensions of issues. No? So we look at the realities, no, when it comes to women and how they do in education, where they are in education, why they are there, because there is still gender tracking for women. The women are still seen as more suited to teaching, social work, nursing, di ba?
Yeah,
Ganun
that's
jobs.
true.
And even in, ma'am, Dr. Raimundo, even in your profession, even in medicine, there are still um areas of specialization considered for women, di ba,
Yes, that's
vis-a-vis men.
true.
Like, di ba? Because there are more women,
Yes.
pag women, pediatrics, dermatology, gynecology. Pag men, urology, orthopedics,
Surgery.
surgery.
Diba?
Di ba? So
Yes.
yung ganon. Pero pare-pareho lang naman kayo nag-aral ng medicine. Di ba?
True.
So, but which are the more higher paying areas of specialization also, pag-isipan natin yung mga ito. So yun po. So when we look at equality, we look also at where are we after being educated. No?
Yeah. Thank you so much for your yeah,
Thank you,
that's so
ma'am.
true. Thank you, thank you.
Ayun po. Hello po. Okay po. Thank you very much po. So, ma'am, last na po ito. So, eto
Maaga
po.
pa! Hanggang 5:30 nga ninyo ako kinontrata, 3:45 na lang. Diba?
Sorry po.
Hindi mo nagmamadali ka na Majet, ah.
Hindi naman po. Baka, baka po kasi overtime. Hindi naman po. Okay po. So, eto po. Personally, what feminist paradigm do you espouse po? E.g. radical feminism, liberal feminism, etc. Is it important for feminist researchers to label themselves as a particular kind of feminist po?
No, not necessarily. I'd be very happy if all feminist researchers called themselves feminists. That's enough. So I don't think you need to label yourself, because we could also be lifting from various feminist theories. Because we don't think in terms of feminism, we think in terms of feminisms. And that is okay. You know, it's okay to be eclectic as long as we agree that women are oppressed and we need to do something about it. Okay. So what do I espouse? So you're asking me what my particular leanings are towards. I would say a mix of see, eclectic nga ako. So, socialist na third world feminist na intersectional feminist. So, that's what I am. Because I'm really very critical of unequal structures. And not only on the basis of gender or class, but both. And other intersectional identities. So, ganun po.
Okay po. And then, ayun po, I apologize po. Pwede pa po kami mag-entertain ng questions.
Si Ma'am Jo.
Ayun po. So, meron pong, I have come across post-colonial feminism as an approach in informing Filipina feminism. Any reflection on this framework, ma'am?
Sorry, maganda siya. Maganda siya. Actually, yung post-colonial feminism, if you look at third world feminism, it also has similarities in terms of analysis. It's important because we also want to focus on what is indigenous, no, to women without the influence of colonial experience. So yes, we should take that third world feminist perspective is a good perspective to use, because it looks at not just women oppressed as women, no, and also as a result of their material conditions, but also as to how these are related to our colonial history. Kasi nga our colonial history also influenced women's location, diba, in society. And also how, if you consider yung third world feminism, pagka-dependency theory din yun. So it looks at unequal structures between nations. In this case, between yung tawag nilang core and periphery, or colonies and colonial masters. So it's this configuration of many factors. So yes, I think it would be nice to do post-colonial analysis of women's situation using third world feminist frameworks.
Okay po. And then, meron pong question from Ma'am Connie Habito. Dr. Natsi, can you suggest some kind of checklist to make sure our research is engendered? So I think
yung presentation ko, Majet has
yes,
a copy of my presentation. It's actually all there, and she can share it with whomever is interested.
Okay po. So ayan po, for anyone who is interested to get a copy po of the checklist or checklist po, you can message us or send us an email po sa gender@upou.edu.ph. So I'm seeing din po ulit si Ma'am Joanne po. She's raising her hand. Tama po ba?
Thank you. It's actually not a question, but comment that thanks to Ma'am Natsi's presentation, we will be using most of our input in revising our checklist for our gender-focused research grant. So I hope you took note of those faces, as well as the checklist that you shared, because we already have a list, but we would like to revise it based on this input. So, ano to shooting two birds with one stone. Ang input ni Ma'am Natsy.
Ma'am Joanne, my references are in the last pages of my presentation. So if you want to go straight to the source, you can also do that.
Yes, thank you for that. We will definitely do that.
Ayun. Thank you very much po ulit, Ma'am Natsy. Yan. So, ayun po
You're
ulit. Ulitin ko
welcome.
lang po. If ever of our participants is interested in getting the checklist or any of Ma'am Natsy's resources po, please send us an email or message po sa Facebook sa gender@upou.edu.ph. Ayun po. I'm welcoming po any questions pa po from others. You may post them po sa ating mga live stream content hosts, and then meron din po sa ating Zoom participants.
Siguro while nag-iisip yung ating mga participants, I'd like to ask Ma'am Natsy. Kasi we have, the gender concerns, gender issues, they have been there for a long time, Pero when we look at research conducted, and when we talk about researchers when they do their proposals, I'm seeing na marami pa rin tayong research which are really gender blind. And for most cases, parang afterthought yung nangyayari when it comes to gender. So parang, naisama ko ba yung gender? So parang lagi siyang afterthought. And I've been with many research groups, unless it is a group on gender, hindi siya afterthought. Pero in many research groups that I've been, in most cases, nagiging afterthought yung gender. So, yung dun sa range na pinakita mo, yung rubric, parang hindi nga gender aware kasi, it becomes gender aware kasi nagkaroon ng afterthought. Pero, hindi siya talaga considered when the project or the research concept is being conceptualized. So, what do you think should we do or proactively do as members of the university, especially ng mga gender offices, about this particular issue?
Ma'am, ang hirap po pag afterthought. Kasi it can't be an afterthought because if you integrate gender in your research, it will affect everything, won't it? Your statement of the problem, your objectives, they all through your methodology, your methods, etc., your instruments, your analysis, pati yung mga frameworks, yung conceptual frameworks, diba? Your theoretical frameworks. So, no, it should never be an afterthought. That's why when you asked me, can you present on how to integrate gender into our research, I was afraid of that, that we would just be parang masabi lang na nalagyan namin ng gender. Diba? So that would just be siguro at the level of a notch above gender blind. So gender aware. Diba? Parang inisip lang. Diba? Gender aware lang siya, pero hindi siya gender sensitive. Okay. So, really, Ma'am Joanne, if you want people to be more concerned about assimilating or incorporating gender into their research, you need to make sure that people are interested in gender issues. And that they, honestly, sometimes I feel we're still at that stage. We still need to continue to raise awareness about unequal gender relations, even in the university. Because if they do not see it as a salient dimension of the research, it means they do not see it as at all. Diba? In other words, they have no consciousness about it. So I would suggest that we continue to raise critical awareness about patriarchy, about women's subordination, male dominance, etc. So yun. And then, so GST. So GST. Because you can't really engender your research if you have no basic knowledge about gender, if you're not at the very least gender sensitive. So, and then, mga ganito po, you can also conduct discussions. I think it will help researchers if they come together and articulate, their challenges in terms of integrating gender in their research. And then those who know more can also help them along, no? Make suggestions on how they can conceptualize a research with a clear gender perspective. So parang tulong-tulong. Yun po. Kasi meron din naman pong may mas expertise kesa sa iba. So we can tap on those resources. Just encourage them. And I love that you are also offering grants. Di ba, nag-review ako ng isang proposal. So yun, that's one way to encourage people to do research with a gender perspective. So there are actually
Thank you, Ma'am
ways.
Nancy, for that. And yeah, UPOU is a gender-focused research grant, and we are actually very proud of it. And I'm very happy that you have helped us in reviewing many of the some of the research proposals. And thank you for that insight, Ma'am Nancy.
Ayan. Thank you very much po, Doc Joanne. Thank you po, Ma'am Natsi. Any questions po from our Zoom participants? I think po, pwede rin naman din po yung live participants natin. Any more questions po? Ayan, meron po. Ayan po. From Sir Albi po, this is a basic question. Generally, in doing surveys, part of the social demographic question is asking about sex or gender, which often give only two choices, male or female. Is this still acceptable in the Philippine setting, or should other identities should be included? What's the best way to ask about sexuality, orientation, and gender identity? Pasensya na po. Ma'am Albi po pala.
Bakit?
Ma'am
Okay,
Albi.
ma'am.
Sorry
Okay.
po.
Okay.
Sorry po.
Okay. Ma'am Alvi, o yan, kinorek na natin. Ma'am, kung ano, meron kaming registration forms, okay? Pwede rin kasing gamitin sa survey forms. We can ask for sex assigned at birth. And in the Philippines, it's only one of two. It's male or female. And then as a second question and a follow-up question, you can ask, what is your gender identity? So, woman, man, non-binary. So yun po ang pwedeng gawin. Kasi nga obviously hindi lang naman hindi na pwedeng binary lang ang ating pagtanaw sa gender. Okay. Is it still acceptable? I don't even know. Sometimes what's acceptable is not necessarily what is right. 'Di ba? So it's still being done, 'di ba? Many times we're only given the option of male, female. Yeah. Okay.
Ayan. Thank you very much
What's
po.
the best way? Ayan.
Ay, sige.
Ay, yung best, meron pa po, may second part pa pala. Majet, what's the best way to ask about sexual orientation and gender identity? I mean, is it necessary? I mean, if you need to ask, then pwede naman. Sexual orientation and then, yung sa gender identity, sinabi ko na, diba? So, sex assigned at birth, male, female. Tapos, gender identity, man, woman, non-binary. So,
Okay po. Ayan, any more questions po? Baka pwede pa po tayo makapag-entertain. Okay, if none po, again, Ma'am Natsi, thank you very much po. I know that we still have a lot of questions, pero sobrang limited lang po yung ating area. So hopefully po, you can go back to this video po for our live participants and our Zoom participants. You may go back to this video sa UPOU Network's website po, and it will always be posted sa aming pong Facebook pages. You can always send an email to gender@upou.edu.ph. Again po, for any questions, inquiries, and ayun po, remind ko lang po, you may also ask us for the checklist and resources that Ma'am Natsi used for her presentation. Ayun po. Again, ma'am, maraming salamat po for the time and the expertise that you have shared with us. And let me present this certificate of appreciation po to Ma'am Natsi. Sorry po, medyo Ayan, University of the Philippines Open University Office of Gender Concerns present this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Nathalie Africa Verceles for serving as the person for our webinar on gender responsive and feminist research given this 3rd of June 2021 conducted via Zoom. Noted by Dr. Joanne V. Serrano, Director of Office Gender Concerns. Maraming salamat po. Ayun po.
Maraming salamat. Hindi pa
Maraming
pinipirmahan ni Doc Jo.
Sorry po.
Walang pirma.
Isasend po.
Doc Jo.
Isasend po namin yung may sign po.
Wala po kasing kuryente.
Okay, hindi naman ako nagmamadali. Baka lang makalimutan ni Doc Jo pirmahan. So,
Assured
hindi na ako
po.
magta-type. Ang dami-dami nagpapasalamat sa chat. Iisa-isahin ko pa. So, I'll just make a general thank you po so very much for your very kind attention. And I hope that I was able to help you along in your feminist research journey. So, thank you very much. Thank you, UPOU Gender Center. I love you.
Apo. So may we invite lang po yung Zoom participants natin to stay and open their cameras. Ayun po, muli po sa ating live participants po, sa ating live stream participants, maraming salamat po for attending our webinar. Please wait for the evaluation form link to be sent po sa inyong mga email. And then for our Zoom participants po, ayun po, may I invite you to open your cameras po. Join us for a photo opportunity. Maraming salamat po for joining us.